Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, November 7th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I am glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, new CMMC rules take effect Monday, with contractors facing unclear thresholds, shifting clauses, and real risks to eligibility. Plus, how a casual conversation changed the way the Idaho National Lab processes nuclear reactor permits. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The decision by the Federal Aviation Administration to reduce air traffic by 10% across 40 high-volume markets beginning this morning isn't just a reaction to the now longest partial government shutdown ever. FAA is seeing the strain on air traffic controllers who are starting to call out sick more often. A new Federal News Network Pulse poll finds FAA employees aren't the only ones working without pay that may be calling out sick or taking part in a sick out if this shutdown continues deep into November. Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller, joins me now to discuss what we found in our latest survey. Jason, thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure, Terry.
So what did respondents tell us about the possibility of more federal employees calling out sick if the shutdown continues?
No surprise, Terry, but more people they think will be calling out sick. About 730 people answered our question, and about 67, almost 68%, so 493 people said they do expect more coworkers to call out sick or do a quote-unquote sick out. Now, interesting enough, people go, I've never heard that term of sick out, and I looked it up online, so it's got to be true, you know that, Terry, that this is a common term for when federal employees or really anyone who says, you know what, we're not happy with what's happening, we can't strike legally, but we do have sick leave and we'll use it. And while it may not be coordinated, it may not be people coming together to say, hey, all of us together will call out sick, I think it's a common term of, hey, this is one way to add some pressure to lawmakers to really reach a deal or come together or to solve whatever challenge they're facing. Now, for our survey, Terry, let me give you just a little bit of background. Just over a 3-day period earlier this week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and part of Thursday, we put the poll out there and said, hey, we just want to hear what people are saying. Again, depending on the question, we got anywhere from 800 to 750 or so people responding. We only asked people who were working. So if you were furloughed, we kicked them out. If you weren't a federal employee, we kicked you out. And just interesting enough that they really do think more people will be calling out sick as the shutdown continues.
And so we've all heard about FAA and transportation security officers already using this tactic. What did the respondents to this survey say about how prevalent this tactic is more broadly across the government?
We've seen some reports that other agencies are starting to see this as a trend, but our survey respondents said about 43%, about 301 out of 692 people said they've not noticed more of their coworkers calling out sick since the shutdown began. Interestingly enough, about 40%, 277, said they have. So we're almost split, a little more no's than yeses, while about 16, almost 17% said they weren't sure if more or less have or haven't. But, you know, we've heard some reports of folks within other agencies saying, you know, maybe this is a tactic they'll use. There was a report that maybe some Social Security Administration offices were closed. We're not able to necessarily 100% confirm that report, but there are concerns whether it's SSA or CMS had to call workers back in that were furloughed to deal with open season, or whether it's folks at the IRS or many, many other agencies that, you know, kind of have workers who are not furloughed, who are working without pay, whether or not they are using this tactic to say, hey, we're just not going to show up as maybe we call it a protest.
Did the survey respondents identify which agencies they worked for? Were you able to draw any trends that way?
We do anonymous surveys, so we don't necessarily ask which agencies they're at. And because this was a pulse poll, because it's something we're going to do it quickly, we're going to get in, get out in a few days, we wanted to kind of make it as quick as possible. So we did not identify which agencies they're at.
So federal workers are now going to miss a second paycheck as of today. Did your survey include questions about how federal workers are dealing with the financial impacts of the shutdown?
We know for a fact there's a lot of financial impacts across the board. We've had stories. Our colleague Drew Friedman wrote about how some of the financial institutions are seeing increasingly number of feds asking for help, whether it's no-interest loans or aid of some sort. We know our sister station, WTOP, has talked about food banks in the Maryland, D.C. area, and I'm sure other areas across the country also are seeing a lot of federal employees there. Our question asks, how concerned are you today about your personal finances now a month into the shutdown? About 51%, more than half, say they are very concerned about their finances. 23% said they're somewhat concerned, and only 13, almost 14% said a little concerned, and about 12% said they're not concerned at all. We asked a little deeper, said, okay, what are you doing? What are some of those things you're doing to belt tightening as the shutdown drags on? Now, interestingly enough, we asked our friends at SurveyMonkey, who we did this, what are some of the themes that emerged? And about 12% told us about discretionary spending. They're cutting back on their discretionary spending. 11% saying they're managing their bills differently, maybe only paying those that they have to, or maybe putting off bill payment. And then about 6% said they're just doing what's the most important thing: mortgage, food, clothes, taking care of their families and the like. So I think there's different ways different folks are trying to manage their expenses. But time and again, we're seeing a lot of people saying, if this continues on, I'm really scared because I'm already tapped into, or I've started to tap into emergency savings, or I'm taking a second job just to help relieve some of the pain.
Jason, we always think about working for the federal government as offering stable employment, competitive incomes. And lately during the shutdown and even earlier, we've been talking about the potential impact on the future federal workforce of all of this disruption, this churn. And now we've got folks in real financial difficulty. Was there any kind of comment in here or your own personal perspective on what this means for the future?
I think anytime you have a shutdown that goes on and on, right? This is the longest shutdown ever now. In the past, shutdowns have been, a couple days, maybe a week. The Congress has seemed to figure it out. And there's always this concern about whether or not other people will want to work for a government or work for the agencies when they're facing this type of challenges. I think this is not just the shutdown is the, I'll call it the unfortunate icing on the cake, right? We've had a year-long concern about the steps the Trump administration has taken that maybe would impact future federal workers who want to come work for the government. I think some of the rifts and then some of the layoffs were very concerning to could I recruit somebody? If someone says, okay, well, I'm going to come work for the government, how long will I be there? Will I get riffed? Well, if I'm a probationary employee, will I get summarily fired, whether or not I deserve it or not? And I think all of those are just building the concern. So again, I think the shutdown just adds another concern about, can the federal agencies continue to recruit, and can they convince people that, all this noise over here is not fun, it's not worthwhile, but 99% of the time it's a good, stable working environment. You're doing good work, you're making a difference, which is what attracts people to the government. And I think what the Trump administration maybe is trying to do is you've seen this with their merit hiring, with their getting more folks, hiring committees. There's a new memo that just came out just earlier the week about kind of setting up these new hiring committees. Can they really focus those hiring committees on attracting people and kind of reassuring them that, there's some stuff that goes on that we can't control, but most of the stuff we can control, and we can create a good environment for you to work in.
It seems like they've got a big trust bump to overcome, though, in order to make that move forward.
I would say that's fair, that what a lot of the people are looking at as they say, okay, this is a challenging environment, right? The economy, we're seeing this across the board. I mean, my federal report from earlier this week, was about people looking for jobs, a contractor and a federal employee who have had hundreds of more than 100 interviews, no job offers, very, very, very frustrating experience. And I think they're not alone. I heard a lot of feedback during the week about people who said, that matches well with what I've heard or what we're seeing more broadly. So I think that, yes, there's a trust factor, but also the government's not the always hiring place that it used to be either. We know there's a hiring freeze. So there's a lot of pieces and parts that still have to come together for the government to be a, if you will, employer of choice.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for bringing us the survey data.
My pleasure.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Still to come, cuts to U.S. emergency food aid are straining global relief efforts and reshaping how the State Department handles humanitarian crises. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. One of the first major cuts from the Department of Government Efficiency hit the U.S. Agency for International Development. About 85% of its programs were eliminated, and the rest, including emergency food aid, were folded into the State Department. That food aid program has long had bipartisan support, but the transition hasn't been seamless. Federal News Network's Eric White recently spoke with Vincent Smith from the American Enterprise Institute to explore the program's growing pains.
Mr. Smith, thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So, let's just get started with the landscape. 85% of the programs, like you heard in my introduction there, a good bit of that was in the food aid distribution area. What does the food distribution look like now from an international, governmental effort standpoint?
Looking purely at the United States and what the current administration is doing, the picture looked extremely bleak in April and May of this year and remains an extremely difficult to assess situation. The demise of USAID in what we can only describe as a very unfortunate approach to trying to deal with government programs that did not carefully account for the consequences for very important programs that have not only humanitarian aid issues, but also national defense concerns, was frankly shocking. It's easy to be very rude about Elon Musk, but when you put someone in charge of trying to deal with government shrinkage, who has no concept of how programs work, no matter how bright and gifted they are, this is what happens. Poor choices are made, thoughtless choices are made, and international aid, both food aid and health aid, have been devastated over the past 9 months because of largely really poorly considered actions in the first 60 to 80 days of the Trump administration. A major concern for the deliverers of food aid is whether or not the capacity of the in-country places that are needed to deliver aid to where it is needed, say in Ethiopia or Malawi or Mozambique, or you pick your country. It's not clear, it was not clear that those important human-based resources to manage aid in country would remain in place. It appears, at least for now, that some capacity to deliver aid has been sustained within the embassy framework to handle aid that is being delivered. But as I looked at the data on how much of the fiscal year 2025 budget had been spent by 2 days before the end of that fiscal year, really astonishingly little of it had been spent. However, conversations with folks who are aware of whether or not agencies, not U.S. government agencies, but agencies such as the World Food Program and non-government organizations involved in delivering aid are able to meet commitments that have been made prior to January the 20th of this year, indicate that those commitments are being sustained. An issue is what new commitments have been made in the last 9 months. And when we looked at information coming out of the Department of State, which is now the organizing department for aid through a new office that has been created, we could only identify 2 new initiatives that had been announced. One was sending quite a lot of emergency food aid to a wide range of countries, 9 or 10 different countries, targeted to helping feed children. And there was another initiative too. But those initiatives involved relatively small amounts of dollars. And we saw no evidence of new aid beyond those 2 programs that were both initiated in August. Now, an interesting question is, what about fiscal 2026? And of course, nobody has a budget for 2026. But if I read the government accounts correctly, there looks like there's a substantial amount of unspent money from fiscal 2025 that can be rolled over or could potentially be rolled over into 2026. And again, these conversations I've had with people aware of what is going on with the NGOs and the World Food Program in terms of delivering aid indicate that aid is going to continue to be delivered. How much aid is I have no knowledge of. It is clear that it looks as though the House Appropriations Committee has wants to set aside, this is a better way, not has, because nobody has done anything recently, but has set aside around about $900 million for international emergency food aid. That's about $1 billion short of what would have been appropriated in most prior years of the last 2 decades. But what is not clear is how much will there be available. According to some estimates, about $700 billion is available that has not been spent in this past fiscal year. So if you add the 900 million to the 700 million, that comes out at, even I can do that math, how old and grumpy though I may be, that's about $1.6 billion, which is not far off what is normally appropriated. But that's purely speculative. And if a major problem looking forward over the next 3 years is that if the House Appropriations Committee's $900 million becomes the new base for funding in the budget, then that's a really dramatic cut from the previous 4 or 5 years in total funding. And carryover funds don't last forever. They just don't.
Presidential impoundment is an issue in several areas where the money is allocated by Congress and the executive branch just doesn't end up spending it. But, this program is different. This isn't, some sort of initiative that the Trump campaign necessarily campaigned on was, we're going to cut food aid. I mean, this has bipartisan support across the board, even when you poll Americans. Are inefficiencies playing part of the blame here for why that money is just kind of sitting there still and not really doing anything?
Inefficiencies. In a recent article I wrote, I described the system as fractured by the Doge operations and firing all of the staff without careful assessment of what really are mission-critical operations. I have the sense from the information sets that I've been given that the State Department is worried about the bipartisan criticism it's getting, both in public and behind closed doors, about not running this program effectively, not getting money out the door to places where there are genuine needs. We're not talking about monies that are spent frivolously here. So the real question is there an infrastructure? And does the State Department have enough clout within the cabinet to enable these emergency food aid programs to move forward? Now, what is really interesting is that in the last 3 weeks, we have seen a really important New York Times story by Christoph talking about the damage that has been done to children and their mothers and so on in Ugandan refugee camps. We've seen another article, and I think it was the AP, about Myanmar and hunger and devastation. And we've had Bill Gates announcing that his foundation's experts have estimated that the number of children's deaths, the child mortality rate, for the first time in maybe 20 years, is going to increase this year. And that's not just because of the United States cutting back, but it's in part, an important part, because the United States has cut back on international aid. There are other countries that have also not stepped up to the plate, if you like, this year in the way that perhaps they would have done 2 or 3 years ago. So these are really important issues. We're talking about, in the humanitarian context, children dying, children who would have otherwise been saved.
We're speaking with Vincent Smith. He's the Director of Agricultural Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Now, you had mentioned that, there were some issues with efficiency in the World Food Programs before all of this took place. And what were some of the areas that actually needed some improvement?
Historically, the International Food Aid Program has been hit by inefficiencies in the following sense. There are two groups, the mercantile shipping lobby in particular, who have really pushed Congress to keep in place two mandates that other countries do not use because they know they are so wasteful in terms of money. And this is not a Trump administration issue per se. It's a congressional issue that spans back to 1954. The two mandates are to have sourcing of almost all food aid in the United States. And the other mandate is that at least a fairly substantial part of it be carried on U.S. ships. Now, the research that we have done that's been published in leading economics journals shows that freight rates charged by those few ships eligible to carry U.S. food aid under this cargo preference, as it's called, mandate, charge between 60 and 100% more for the same journey to get aid where it's needed than if we had competitive bidding for those shipments. But in addition, many times the money would be more efficiently used in terms of meeting needs if the agency managing that money were free to source the food from the best location. What do I mean by best location? The locations from which you can get the food at least total cost and get the food to the children and families that need it most efficiently. Chris Barrett at Cornell and some other researchers have estimated that this U.S. sourcing mandate delays the delivery of food by as much as 4 or 5 months to the places it is needed, compared to if we did what almost every other aid-giving country does, which is to allow the most efficient, least-cost way, most speedy ways of sourcing the food that is needed. That doesn't mean to say you wouldn't source food in the United States. We have plenty of emergency food aid needs in the Caribbean. All you have to do is think about the Dominican Republic and Haiti in particular. And there are plenty of times when the U.S. is where you want to source the food because it's the most efficient, quickest place to go. But putting these constraints has been estimated to waste over the last, especially over the last 30 years, as much as 30% of Congress's authorized funding for the program. Well, that translates into 2 to 4 to even 6 million folks that we're not helping. Now, why do we care about this? Well, one, if you're a decent human being, you do care about helping people in dire need that none of us in the United States really can even conceive of. Unless we're being white slaved or something like that. I mean, you just can't conceive of it. $2 a day to live is very difficult. But there's also a self-interested purpose. Almost all of military leadership, if you have them, most of them in public, well, perhaps not right now with the current challenges that any admiral or general or Air Force commander faces under the current Secretary of I think of it as defense. I'm sorry. Food aid and aid in terms of health, ways in which America has created wonderful goodwill in otherwise very difficult countries that face internal conflicts and so on. And so you have the situation where most leaders in the military, in public under previous administrations, and certainly in private now behind closed doors, would say, the military implications, the national defense implications are very significant. Food aid reduces the risk of boots on the ground. And that's been a consistent story, and it's a real story. So if we're spending $2 billion a year and generating goodwill throughout sub-Saharan Africa and across the globe, that's a big deal in terms of foreign policy and the reduction in the risk of conflict.
Going forward, in those conversations with the people that are now in charge of this massive undertaking, I characterized them as growing pains in my introduction. Is that what they feel? Do they feel as if things are moving in the right direction and they're kind of learning on the go? Yeah, it's not ideal, but, and more needs to be done. Or is there just going to have to be some political will behind this to actually make this as efficient and as long-standing as it probably should be if we want to, feel good about ourselves?
Well, I believe, now, I don't interview senators and congressmen on a daily basis, or very rarely do I have face-to-face interactions with those decision makers, and that's great. If they're spending time talking to me, they've got to find better things to do with their time. But it's clear that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, many of the members of those committees are deeply concerned about sustaining and, if anything, significantly expanding. And when I say significantly expanding, we're not talking about a measurable share of the federal budget, but sustaining and expanding both emergency food aid and emergency health aid, because they recognize the contributions that those actions make, both in a humanitarian way and given their concerns about foreign policy and national security and foreign relations, sustaining that world. Within those committees, there's a strong political will to continue, sustain the program, and many of the members over the years have indicated they would like to see it be more efficiently run. That is, not having these mandates for sole sourcing and cargo preference. That's not true of everybody. The cargo preference lobby claims that it creates hundreds and thousands of jobs in the mercantile sector, and loss of that would be damaging. That's probably not correct. They also claim that it's helping the U.S. shipping industry. There's no evidence of that at all. Those claims are really, I think, a front for a few shipping companies. So there's lots of interesting twists to this story. This is a case of very small benefits being desperately sought by particularly the maritime lobby. But it's also the case that there are some members of the House Agriculture Committee in particular, but also the Senate Committee, who think that sourcing for food aid in the United States benefits directly their constituents, wheat farmers in Kansas, for example. But that isn't, if benefit means raising the price of wheat or corn in Kansas or Iowa, that really is not the case. In 1954, 30% of all U.S. exports were international food aid. That's 1954. That is 70 years ago. Today, less than 1% of the U.S. corn crop and the U.S. wheat crop are shipped internationally. And that represents very little in the way of any impact on the price of wheat or the price of corn. Just as an aside, what matters for the price of corn in Iowa or the price of wheat in Kansas is not domestic production and domestic demand for particularly for wheat. It's certainly not domestic production. These are globally traded commodities. The U.S. right now produces less than 7% of total world wheat production. It's a small fraction in a large market. Changing the availability of the commercial wheat supply from the U.S. to the international market by diverting a very small amount into international food aid has zero effect on the price of wheat at the local country elevator. The same holds true for corn and most other commodities.
Vincent Smith is the Director of Agricultural Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you so much for showing us all this information and sharing it with us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And you can find this interview on our website. Head to federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. We'll also post a link to Vincent's study.
Still to come, new CMMC rules take effect on Monday, with contractors facing unclear thresholds, shifting clauses, and real risks to eligibility. But first, how a casual conversation changed the way the Idaho National Lab processes nuclear reactor permits. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. It was almost by happenstance that the Idaho National Lab in the Energy Department and Microsoft came up with an idea to change the way nuclear reactors are permitted and licensed. During a discussion about something entirely different, the idea of using artificial intelligence to reduce the administrative burden of the application process for construction permits and operating licenses for nuclear power plants came to bear. For more on how Idaho National Lab is testing AI for permitting and licensing, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller talked to Chris Ritter, the division director for scientific computing and AI at the Idaho National Lab.
For now, right, the initial goal, right, is prove that it can be used to help that last step, right, that documentation generation process, follow the template guidelines. Basically, some people call it PowerPoint engineering for different phases. We'll call this word engineering, right? Getting into the right buckets for Word, help you get something across. You theoretically, too, could have some of these models, right, check your work, right? Did I miss anything that's a requirement? Things like that. But it's not doing the engineering. It's not doing the analysis, right? It's putting the information in the right bits, right, for you at this state, which is helpful, right? But it isn't dramatically going to change the entire nuclear energy overnight. And I think where we're trying to get to eventually, right, is that state where, again, we can work through that agentic process of the whole design flow. And at that point, the paper that we wrote, this is 3 years ago now, so this is kind of pre-ChatGPT era, we guessed a 21% improvement. We have not yet updated the paper looking at the modern state of Gen AI. If you ask Gen AI tools themselves, it varies, every time you get a different answer, right? But they guess themselves, like a Claude or a ChatGPT, they're guessing like a 30 to 50% improvement. We'll have to see after we can quantify this and verify those numbers. But we do think that there's a very significant improvement that could be made on the time, the life cycle time, and the cost time it takes to go through this whole process. And then, of course, make it more dynamic, right? And allow commercial industry in the country, right, to be able to fit solutions, right, that make sense for that particular customer or stakeholder. Not everyone wants the same power output for their power plant.
There's an article just, I think in the New York Times, where they talked about nuclear reactor in a truck and the mobile one. And again, to your point, hey, different use cases, different reasons why they may want something. You mentioned the benefits, the improvements potential, both cost, life cycle, process. How's this all coming together? Like, walk me through. We're taking this tool that Microsoft built, we're applying the data from NRC, we're applying the data from Idaho National Lab, without getting into the bits and the bytes side, but give me a little bit more level down of detail about kind of how the permitting process is going to be improved if all works out well.
For now, like from like a level of detail, right, we're deploying their tools to the Microsoft Azure environment, and we're bringing it into the government cloud environment, right, which will be new. And so, as you probably know, AWS GovCloud, Azure for Government, they're different, right, versus the commercial offering. So we're bringing that infrastructure into the government cloud. We're verifying that it works the same way that it works in the commercial cloud. And then, of course, we have the ability, once we're in that cloud environment, to augment, add our own context, right, to the model. We can even use their existing model, right, and then add our context to it. So maybe that's the first way to think about it, right, is their model is already trained to build this documentation at the NRC space. What we then can do, right, is fill that context window up that their tool already accepts with automated information coming from our tools, right? So getting on the early days, right, the ability to kind of prove out some of this workflow. Of course, from like so that's one angle, like kind of the pure research angle. The second part of this, of course, is looking at can we just use the tools to see efficiency gains on our side? And then what is that gain? So I think in the Gen AI space right now, right, a lot of folks are looking for quantitative metrics of, how much better if we use this tool are we getting with X? What is that efficiency improvement? And I think with nuclear specifically at the licensing process, there's a lot of tools that are currently being built. Microsoft has one of the tools. There's another company, Atomic Canyon, that has built a RAG-based model too that does these kind of things. So there's a lot of is good, right? There's a lot of new startups entering the space, but I think there's a gap yet to understand what is that efficiency gain going to be. And so I think being able to verify what that gain is really helpful if I was a reactor vendor, to understand where to apply the tool and what benefit or non-benefit would I be expected to see. The funny part with Gen AI, right, is like Satya Nadella says that he knows that we've like achieved the real goal when we're seeing a 10% GDP improvement. He said this publicly, right? We are not yet seeing that, right, as a nation or as a world complex in AI. And so I think it's really important to be able to quantify the impact that we are seeing in certain spaces and try to amplify that impact over time and prove it's possible. And I think we're really at those first days of that. I think agentic coding may be the first example where we're starting to see real quantitative data. So hopefully we can see that here as well, is what I'm getting at. And that's a key goal of this, right, is to verify.
I think it's, as you said, very important to figure out those how to quantify and then amplify the impact. Typically, based on, you had mentioned this earlier, to get a nuclear reactor approved, it can take decades. It can take just years and years and years. Do you expect this? The hope is that the increase will be able to open the door for more companies, more organizations to kind of get through this process in a better way. And part of that, the reason why, is because the technology that's available, right? The technology is kind of driving this change. Is that the connection that's happening?
So to an extent, yes. I think it's a multifaceted problem. If you look at something, right, like nuclear, where we really want to bring that cost and schedule down significantly, it's not one thing that causes the issues, right? So certainly like developing the licensing documentation is an issue, but also, so Vogtle, for example, there was a great report called the Liftoff Report that DOE put together, and they identified multiple issues that led to the delays. The root causes which they identified were incomplete design. So again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but starting the construction before the design was complete, an inadequate level of detail in the integrated project schedule, poor project controls, inadequate quality assurance, poor risk management, and limited design constructability. So basically, the design as originally designed wasn't actually easily, transferable to the field of construction. If you think about it, almost all of those issues have to do with this design lifecycle. And so we think those issues are issues that we can significantly improve with Gen AI. And this Microsoft tool is one aspect that will help. Also, we're seeing change for the administration, right? Changing the NRC rules with how much time they have to review a process. So a new design is coming down to 18 months. There's a time-limited process, time-bound, right, to make sure that these things happen on time. But then there's also things that AI itself arguably can't necessarily solve. So two issues that were identified with Vogtle, right? Like one was the COVID-19 pandemic, and arguably AI probably itself, right, can't solve that. You could argue when we worked on the Versatile Test Reactor, which was another reactor program during the COVID pandemic, and the project director at the time actually cited, at the time, this is like pre-AI, pre-Gen AI at least, but cited our digital engineering systems as one of the reasons we stayed on schedule. So maybe it could help in that kind of situation. But certainly, I don't think any AI model would have perfectly predicted how COVID-19 played out, and nor what those effects would be on a project. Another thing that affected Vogtle was a shortage of experienced labor. And again, maybe AI could tell you that you might have this problem in this particular region, but still some of that are other things, right, that will have to be changed for that to be improved.
Chris Ritter is the Division Director for Scientific Computing and Artificial Intelligence at the Idaho National Lab in the Energy Department, speaking there with Federal News Network's Executive Editor, Jason Miller. Still to come, new CMMC rules take effect on Monday, with contractors facing unclear thresholds, shifting clauses, and real risks to eligibility. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Starting Monday, some defense contracts will require verified cybersecurity compliance under new CMMC rules. But contractors face murky thresholds, shifting clause language, and real risks to eligibility. For the details on the changes, Federal News Network's Jared Serbu spoke with Dan Ramish, partner at Haynes Boone.
Dan, we now have a final rule, actually multiple final rules, telling us where the Defense Department is headed with CMMC. It's been a long time coming. As we sit here in the fall of 2025, I mean, generally, how would you assess the level of clarity that folks have about how this is going to play out once we start really moving into the implementation stage here?
Well, Jared, I would say there are some questions about how the rollout will take place, and the final rule included in Title 48 actually created some new questions. So one of the big questions, there are two central pieces of the CMMC program, really. One of them is that over time, these verification requirements will be implemented, and that'll include for most contractors that have contracts involving CUI, a certified third-party assessment. But the other piece of CMMC is that contractors are actually going to have a passing score that they are implementing cybersecurity requirements, whereas currently they only need to do an assessment and report the summary scores of that assessment without reference to having a particular passing score, having implemented a certain number of the security requirements. So this is going to be a big deal. Starting November 10th, some contracts will require contractors to have a certain level of cybersecurity implementation with regard to the 110 cybersecurity requirements in NIST 800-171. The question is, which contracts will have the CMMC clause and which won't? And it's going to matter so much because, again, it's going to be an issue of eligibility for award. So you could lose out on a contract if you don't have sufficient cybersecurity compliance. And the uncertainty here stems from the fact that there is language in the Title 32 rule and the Title 48 rule that is different. So the Title 32 rule suggests that DoD, as of Phase 1, which begins on November 10th, 2025, intended to include the CMMC statuses in clauses in all contracts and solicitations. Whereas the Title 48 rule that came out in September says that during the first 3 years, the CMMC requirement will be included in only certain contracts. So it's unclear which contracts will or won't have it, or whether all contracts will have the CMMC clause or not.
But I think part of the take-home message there is you, as a potential bidder, potential offerer on any of these contracts, have no control over what DoD ends up doing on any particular contract and whether the clauses are going to be included or not. So that probably means it's time to be ready no matter what.
That's right. Contractors shouldn't be rolling the dice, and potentially losing out on an important contract opportunity that may include the CMMC clause.
And so what do we know about, as you just did a great job of taking us through, there's a lot of murkiness about which contracts are going to include this or not. But what do we know about sort of the process DoD is going to use to decide whether those clauses are going to end up going into those contracts, at least during this first phase where they're leaving themselves quite a bit of discretion?
So the Title 48 rule basically says that it'll be up to the requiring activity to make the determination of CMMC, that the CMMC program office will direct the component program offices as to inclusion of the requirement. The other issue, besides whether the clause will be in the contract at all, is whether self-assessment will be included, or whether some contracts may include certification assessment for CMMC Level 2. And there's discretion in that as well. There is a little bit more guidance as to that piece of it when the decision might be made to include a certification assessment requirement. DoD's frequently asked questions says that PMs should only make use of the discretion to include C3PAO assessment during Phase 1 when, informed by adequate market research, there's reason to believe there are enough qualified offerors, including their subcontractors, to provide adequate competition. So if there are enough contractors that have a certification assessment for a particular requirement, then there's a greater chance that DoD might decide to include certification assessment, and you could lose out even if you have self-assessed and are compliant, either conditionally or fully compliant.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes to mind here is, it may be an incentive toward or an incentive against overclassification in some cases here. Of course, a problem that has been existent in the government for a long time. if you run into a situation now where whether you're designating things as CUI or not could determine whether or not you need to have CMMC in a contract, that could be a fairly powerful force on the government side to at least make you take a second look at the requirements in your contract and say, hey, is this really CUI or not?
Yes. Well, and the backdrop to that is that a significant portion of the defense industrial base isn't at the full passing score as yet for CMMC level 2. And there have been a number of studies, one of them fairly recently from a company called Cybersheath, that suggested that the median SPRS score based on 300 survey respondents was 60, whereas the full compliance score is 110. So a lot of contractors have work to do, and DoD requiring activities, of course, want to get their products and services from the contractors. And so on the one hand, the cybersecurity concerns are real. The national security implications of cybersecurity are real. But on the other hand, the Department of Defense needs to get their stuff. And so this has always been the tension all along. And I hope that you're right, that as the stakes increase with the CMMC clause, that the government will take a more serious look at what really needs to be marked as CUI and be more discerning in that. But part of the challenge is that there isn't at this stage a standardized method for identifying what CUI will be involved in a given contract. That's something that's addressed in the FAR CUI proposed rule, but that is kind of on hold with the whole revolutionary FAR overhaul that's taking place. So there's still going to be some challenge and some need for informal communication between prime contractors and the government, or between subcontractors and prime contractors, to figure out even what is going to be CUI under a contract.
Yeah, I want to make sure I've got my head around that last piece. So you as a vendor, when you see an RFP, you may not necessarily know, just based on those solicitation documents, whether or not there's going to be CUI involved in performance of the work. And you may not know at the outset whether or not, or at what level you need to be compliant with CMMC. Is that the upshot of all that?
Well, so there will be a designation of what CMMC level is required. The clause will designate which CMMC level is required. But just because CMMC level 2 is designated for a given solicitation or contract doesn't mean that all information that is provided by the government or that's generated in performance is going to be controlled unclassified information. And it's important to know what specific information is subject to handling and dissemination controls, because contractors need to take appropriate precautions, and they may have CUI on some information systems and not on others. And so ensuring that they are properly directing the flow of materials that are actually CUI is critical for compliance with the cybersecurity requirements. And so if they don't have that information, if that's not clearly indicated in the contract, because there is no standardized form for that to happen as yet, that creates a challenge.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that this is not the time to roll the dice anymore. But are there some areas or windows where, depending on the type of work you do, you can get away with completely avoiding CMMC altogether? Are there places where contractors really can still play and not worry about anything that we've been talking about the last 10 minutes?
So this is a big point of debate, because CMMC level 1 is actually going to apply to the largest portion of the defense industrial base, and CMMC level 1 corresponds to the basic safeguarding requirements that are currently in the FAR. And those requirements are intended to be less onerous, but they are government unique requirements. And to get out of even CMMC level 1, there are really two ways around it. One of them is there is an exception for COTS items. So if a contract is solely for commercially available off the shelf, that's one exception. There's going to maybe be greater need to drill down on what specifically is COTS. Of course, we live in an age where if you're buying something off the shelf, there may be different options. And if the same options are available to the government as are available in the commercial marketplace, does that still make it COTS? There are questions like that where there could be gray areas. The other piece is federal contract information. if there's no federal contract information, then CMMC level 1 isn't going to be required, assuming there also isn't CUI. Federal contract information is just non-public government information that's involved in the contract. And the way that is interpreted by the government is going to be important because, of course, a lot of the information that's involved in contract performance is going to be accessible through the Freedom of Information Act. But the Department of Defense declined to say that anything that's FOIAble is not FCI. So it may be challenging to demonstrate that you don't have any non-public federal information. There are going to be some exceptions if the government makes the information publicly available, like on a public website, or certain like financial payment information isn't going to be FCI. But short of that, I think it'll be interesting to see whether there are questions about getting out of CMMC altogether based on the lack of FCI.
All right, Dan Ramish, partner at Hayes Boone. Dan, thanks for taking the time, and it sounds like based on a lot of the questions that we've raised today, we're going to be talking about this for a few more years to come. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Sharon.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Like the other military services, the Army has now recovered from the recruiting challenges it faced over the last several years. But even during the peak of those problems, a bright spot was that retention stayed strong. Now the Army is trying to capitalize on that strength by thinking more carefully about which soldiers it keeps and where. As Federal News Network's Jared Serbu reports, the service wants to retain its soldiers in the fields where they're most needed, focus its retention efforts more on officers, and put an emphasis on quality over quantity.
Officials say retention and actively managing it is going to be a major focus area over the coming year, much like recruiting was over the last several years. Brigadier General Gregory Johnson is the Director of Military Personnel Management at Army Headquarters.
If you look back at how we've done retention for the last 40 years, it's really been an aggregate mission. We think about, hey, how do I drive the end strength the Army needs? And then that's the number I come up with from eligible folks that are ETSing either this year or the following year. And we really looked at our team and said, hey, is that driving readiness for the Army? Is that driving the quality we need, the skill sets we need? Is it doing what we need to drive how we respond to ATI and the decisions of Army senior leaders? And there was a collective no. And so our team, and many of them are out in the audience here, have really taken a look at how we get precise in how we look at retention. So we're leaning on and expanding who we retain.
Part of that effort involves creating new quality metrics for enlisted soldiers and then creating new ways to connect retention incentives to those measures of quality over the next several years. But Army officials say they're also recognizing that those incentives don't necessarily need to be financial ones, and that giving soldiers more control over the direction of their careers, where they're stationed, and for how long can be powerful retention incentives too. The service is beginning to apply that idea to officers, including through a program that lets them change to other branches of the Army at earlier points in their careers. Previously, officers needed to wait until their 7th year of service, but starting with Year Group 21, a pilot program began letting members voluntarily transfer into branches that have shortages, like finance, signal, and logistics. Major General Hope Rampey, the commander of Army Human Resources Command, says giving those officers more choices makes sense right now, as retention rates are starting to dip ever so slightly.
But we saw a couple of year groups that had maybe a dip of 1% or a dip of 2%. So I'm not saying there's an issue, but I'm saying there's an indicator. The data is indicating that you're not on a historical trend. So why wait for a problem? And why not get ahead of it? And so I think it's twofold. It's helping to hopefully retain officers, at least at that historical trend. But also, I think it's kind of motivating for the young officers. They're excited. You know, I have a choice. You know, I can change career paths. And we shouldn't push against that. You know, it's okay. And I think it aligns with, you know, Gen Z's passion for service, because I don't think they get enough credit for that. They have a passion for service, but they also want to be challenged. They want to feel valued and purposeful. And that doesn't mean doing the same job forever.
Rampey says the Army plans to announce details for an expanded voluntary transfer program later this month.
We want to show that there's an opportunity to serve a career in the Army, but not do the same thing for the rest of your life. Now there are certain branches that you can leave and certain branches you can go into, or functional areas. And usually you had to be a captain or a major to go into a functional area. And so we have floors, and we have where a certain number that are pre-key and developmental, meaning as a lieutenant you can switch. And then we have certain numbers to protect the functional areas in some of the branches that they can only have a certain number that are then post-key and developmental, a captain.
Meanwhile, officials are also working on new ways to help nudge soldiers into branches that might be a better fit for them than the one they're currently serving in. That's more possible today than it was a few years ago because the Army's new Integrated Pay and Personnel System, or IPPS-A, includes self-professed skills and knowledge for every soldier. Army personnel officials are exploring ways to use AI to scrape that data and make better use of it. But Colonel Tom Maleko, the Chief Talent Analytics Officer at Army Human Resources Command, says the Army is also looking to build more structured indices of soldier talent.
For me, it starts with understanding what are the job end requirements. And so the Army, since about 2020, has been on a committed path to understanding what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities required to perform each role in the Army, whether it is a battalion commander of an infantry formation to whether it is a UAS operator in the 25th Infantry Division. What are those knowledge, skills, and abilities required to perform that? Once we have those, the next step then becomes measuring the competencies and attributes of our individual soldiers. And so one of the things we're looking at developing is known as the Officer Assessment Battery. It's a assessment, and it's really designed to be just one part of a career-long set of assessments that you'll take throughout your time in service to better understand what are your knowledge, skills, and abilities and how are they evolving over time. Fundamentally, once you start to have those two different points of data, then we can start to optimize our job selection. Because from my perspective, when we talk talent management, it's about getting the right soldier in the right job at the right time.
Another area where the Army's hoping to make more use of AI in the promotion board process for its soldiers. Maleko says the main purpose would be to help screen service members as part of a multiple hurdle selection process.
The current process, I think, has served us well, right? It's been a process that's been in place for 7 years and has led to the leader selections that we have today. And so I think really the matter is more we have technology now that'll enable us to be more efficient and more effective over the course of the next 20, 30, 40 years or so. And so thinking about it, can we integrate components of what we would call a multiple hurdle selection strategy, right? Can we screen out individuals that are not really competitive for the process up front, and then helping our board members to focus their valuable time and resources on those individuals that are then most competitive for that selection. And so how can we kind of focus their attention in on those areas where really only humans can make the good judgment call, and then using computers to screen out based on more discrete criterion. If you have not commanded at a certain level yet, if you have not been to a certain type of school, and then letting humans then make those subjective decision judgments that only humans can truly do.
Jared Serbu, Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.
You can find Jared's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Standiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.